Hi guys. Sorry. Okay, here's the lecture PowerPoint thingy for week 6. Second week on Othello, last week on Shakespeare. And I know that we said last time that I would try and talk about Iago and Othello and Emilia and Desdemona this week, but that's just too much, it turns out. So I'm just going to talk about Desdemona and Emilia. And I know that, as I said last week, I know I've given you a lot about Othello, and I know I'm kind of throwing things at you, but hopefully now you should get a decent sense of what happens in the play and who all the characters are. If you have any questions, if you do want to work on Othello for your assignments and you have any questions about what happens when or who does what, you can write to me or you can ask me in one of the catch-up sessions. Okay, so I've also uploaded a couple of extra documents, as you'll see, to try and clarify things a little bit. But it's quite a plot-heavy play. Quite a lot happens quite quickly, and yeah, it's not that easy to follow. But anyway, we'll just go on and we'll focus on Desdemona and Emilia for this week. Okay, so Othello and Desdemona are the central couple, but they're not the only pair. They're not the only. It's not the only relationship between two characters which is of interest in Othello. And yeah, we could spend a long time talking about Iago and Othello as well. One of the major questions for anyone who reads Othello and wants to engage with it is why Othello believes Iago when he says that when he tries to convince him that Desdemona has been unfaithful, and why Iago. Another question is why Iago does what he does at all, and both of those questions need to be answered by looking at the relationship between the two men. However, we're not really going to do that this week. Instead, we're going to look at the kind of friendship and the servant mistress relationship between Desdemona and Emilia, who is Iago's wife. And Emilia is she's a relatively minor character in the play. She's probably um, the most minor character to still be considered a really important character. However, she's very memorable, she's extremely brave, and she's flawed in ways which are interesting, I think. And she plays a very important role in the plot of the play as well, as we'll see. It's her who kind of reveals the what's really taken place to Othello. It's her who tells him that Iago has lied, and it's her who refuses to listen to either Othello or Iago when they kind of tell her to shut up and try and make sure that they can get away with what they've done in some way or another. So she is very, very important, and her relationship with Desdemona does give us one of several, actually, images of female friendship in Shakespeare, which are certainly worth talking about and worth dwelling on. So, we don't see Emilia until Act 3, so this is when the play has moved to Cyprus after having started off in Venice. And she appears alongside Othello and Desdemona kind of the morning after Cassio has had the brawl and has just been sacked. And she is Desdemona's servant. The two have a kind of mutual respect and affection, but they are from different social classes. And kind of all you see Desdemona, Emilia, and Cassio talking about how Desdemona might be able to help Cassio get his job back by petitioning and by asking Othello to reinstate him on his behalf. And at this point, nobody knows that Iago is going to use Desdemona's kind of good nature and her willingness to speak up for Cassio against her and against Othello, and is going to use this as kind of evidence that Desdemona is having an affair, which of course we know that she isn't. In Act 3, Scene 3, which is a very long scene and is the most important scene in the play because it's the scene in which Iago begins to really strongly influence Othello. Um, After Iago has begun to kind of chip away at Othello's confidence in Desdemona, Emilia finds a handkerchief that Othello gave to his wife when they were falling in love. She says that Iago asks her to steal it for him and gives a speech, quite a small speech, where she says that she does not know why he wants it, but she will give it to him anyway because it is not her place to ask why. She essentially says she is just a woman and Iago's wife, and that it is her role to obey her husband. And I think very strongly we can say that this isn't a kind of statement of agreement. She doesn't say that, this is a good thing, but it's kind of how life is for her, really, and for women in general, in Shakespeare's time. And we can look at this speech at scene 3. Emilia says, "I'm glad I found this napkin," which is another word for a handkerchief. This was her first remembrance from the moor. So a remembrance is a kind of keepsake, something to remember someone by. So it was just a little gift that Othello gave to Desdemona. And it was the first one, so it was important. And she says, "My wayward," so my kind of naughty, misbehaving husband, "have 100 times wooed me to steal it. But she so loves the token, for he conjured her she should ever keep it, that she reserves it evermore about her to kiss and talk to." So Desdemona is very attached to this token, to this handkerchief. Othello has said she should always have it with her, and she does. And then Emilia says, "I'll have the work taken out," which means that I will have it copied. I'll have the kind of pattern on the handkerchief copied, and then I'll give it to Iago. I know not what, give it to Iago. What he will do with it, heaven knows, not I. Heaven knows, not I. I nothing, but to please his fantasy, is an important line. So she doesn't know what Iago is planning to do with the handkerchief. She clearly doesn't know that he's planning to bring about the kind of catastrophe that he brings about at the end of the play. But she kind of says, "It doesn't matter that I don't know," and she says, "I nothing but to please his fantasy." And we can imagine her saying this in quite a resigned way, quite a matter-of-fact way. And the word fantasy here, I think, is interesting because on the one hand, it could mean fantasy in the sense of a kind of fantastical adventure or a kind of sexual fantasy. On the other hand, it could just mean imagination. Could just mean something in his head. It doesn't have to be very complicated. And we talked last week about how Othello and Desdemona kind of create these images of each other for each other as the way in which they fall in love. And Emilia, I think, here has a real insight into what a lot of kind of husband and wife relationships were like during this period, and maybe still are like. It's a kind of fantasy. It's a kind of mutually constituted, made up image of each other. And Emilia herself, the real Emilia, feels as if she just exists in order to support this image that Iago has of her. And, maybe she needs to do this for all kinds of social reasons. She's economically dependent on her husband in a lot of ways. It's considered to be socially the norm that she would obey him and that she would do what he says. So she really doesn't, in some ways, obviously not entirely, but in some ways she really actually doesn't exist outside of his fantasy, and she needs to keep obeying it and keep pleasing it in order to keep the kind of life that she has. And then Iago arrives and they have a kind of little argument, and instead of Emilia having the chance to copy the handkerchief, Iago snatches it from her, grabs it, and says, "I have use for it. Go, leave me. Get out of here, woman. I don't need to tell you what I want it for. I've got a reason to have it." And we can imagine Emilia at this point becomes quite suspicious and also quite possibly guilty. She wasn't planning on just giving it to Iago. She was planning on having it copied and then giving it back to Desdemona. And then Iago lets the audience in on his plan that he's going to use it to kind of build up Othello's suspicion by leaving it in Cassio's lodging and convincing Othello that Desdemona gave it to Cassio. Anyway, so handkerchief plays a key role in Iago's plan, and it is Emilia who gives it to him. And before Emilia gives it to him, she gives this speech about how she herself, and we can say kind of women in general, exist to please the fantasy of men. Not that that's all that women are. That's not what Shakespeare is saying. But socially, the way that social relations work, women are essentially treated as if they should just support the image that their husbands have of them, and they shouldn't challenge that. So, Act 3, Scene 4, which is the following scene, we see Desdemona looking for the handkerchief quite desperately. She's very upset by the fact that she has lost it, and she asks Emilia where it's gone. And Emilia, at this point, she lies and says, "I do not know." She says she doesn't know where it's gone. We can see this here. Desdemona says, "Where should I lose that handkerchief, Emilia?" And Emilia says, "I know not, madam." And Desdemona says, "I would rather have lost my purse full of cruzados," so all the money in the world all the money that Desdemona has, she would rather have lost. And then she says, "Oh, well, at least Othello isn't jealous." Dramatic irony there, because we know that Othello is becoming jealous. And we can imagine Emilia at this point becoming quite concerned. We'll see that Emilia understands men, at least the men of this play, much more than Desdemona does, who is also a lot. We can imagine Desdemona to be quite a lot younger than Emilia. Emilia is quite worldly. She knows how the world works, and in some ways she's quite cynical. And she says, "Are you sure that Othello isn't jealous?" And at this point, Othello enters, and we saw the kind of exchange that Othello and Desdemona have about the handkerchief a bit last week, and it's clear that Othello is starting to lose it at this point. And then we saw that exchange last week, and then Emilia and Desdemona have a kind of conversation about jealousy, in which Emilia says, "Look, is this man not jealous? Look what you've just seen from Othello. You've seen him kind of incessantly questioning you about this handkerchief." And Desdemona says, "I've never seen this before. I've never seen this side of him." And she says, "There's some wonder in this handkerchief. I am most unhappy in the loss of it." So something's really, really magical, really strange about this handkerchief if it's had such an effect on Othello, me losing it. And of course we know that it's not really about the handkerchief at all. It's about Iago's manipulations of Othello, which are making him feel this way, and he's just projecting that onto the handkerchief. It's just a handkerchief, And through all of this, we know that Emilia knows that she's given it to Iago, and she's choosing not to say anything. So any thinking about this relationship would also have to think about why Emilia doesn't just tell Desdemona, or tell Othello where it is, in fact. There are a number of possible reasons for this. Maybe she's afraid, maybe she is aware that she would get into a lot of trouble if she's found to have been stealing her mistress's, her superior's gifts and helping her husband take them. Maybe she's more like Iago than she wants to admit at this point, and she kind of wants to see what will happen. But at the same time, she's also very obviously concerned for Desdemona, and she wants to kind of tell her a bit about what men are like, and about what the situation that she's in is like. And she says, "'Tis not a year or two shows us a man." So we don't just get to know someone, especially not our husbands, after only a year or two. And then she says, she gives this kind of very nihilistic image. They are all but stomachs, and we are but food. They eat us hungrily, so greedily, and when they are full, they belch us. So they burp us out, they kind of vomit us out once they're full. Once they've had what they want from us, and once they've used us, they will cast us away. It's not clear that this is what Shakespeare thinks all relationships are like, but it's certainly how Amelia's attitude expresses itself. She's a very pragmatic person. She knows what the world is like. She has quite a lot of experience of male and female relationships, and she's married to Iago, who is not a nice guy. So she does, while we may not necessarily say that Shakespeare thinks all marriages are like this, and that men simply consume their wives as if they were food, and then they burp them out, we can take Amelia as really believing this, and as knowing where she's coming from. And again, we might think about how to stage this in terms of a relationship between quite an innocent Desdemona, someone who is not very experienced, could be seriously young, could be a teenager, could be about 15, and an older, more experienced Amelia who is cynical, but also loving and careful, and wants to protect Desdemona as best as she can do. And then Cassio and Iago come in, and Cassio kind of asks Desdemona whether or not she's had any luck, and Desdemona says, "I'm kind of not in favour, my advocation is now not in tune, which means that my attempt to appeal to Othello is not getting a good response. I'm not someone he wants to listen to right now." And she says, "My lord is not my lord." So he's out of sorts. He's not his usual self. And Iago very, innocently says, "Oh, is he angry?" And Iago knows exactly what's going on. And he says that Iago kind of says that he will go and talk to Othello and try and calm him down, whereas we know that he's going to go and talk to him and he's going to make him even more jealous, because Iago is pulling all the strings here. Then Desdemona says, "I hope something of state." So I hope something to do with Othello's role as a servant of the Venetian state is kind of upsetting his mind, and is kind of making him stressed out, rather than anything that I've done. And again, we kind of see a bit more about what relations between men and women are really like in Shakespeare's time, because we see that Desdemona and Othello don't talk really about Othello's responsibilities, about his job, about his affairs of state. That's all public life, and for Othello and Desdemona, it's not something that they share with each other. It's not something that Desdemona is concerned with. And again, we see a kind of contrast here, perhaps, between Othello and Desdemona and Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And Macbeth and Lady Macbeth do talk to each other about things which are in their minds and in their souls. And they do talk to each other about their ambitions and their kind of public duties, or Macbeth's public duties. Othello and Desdemona don't, and we see the fact that they don't now is in kind of increasing the tension in their relationship. And Emilia tries to educate Desdemona and says, first of all, I hope it's state matters. 2, pray heaven it's state matters. Nor no jealous toy concerning you. A jealous toy here is just something inconsequential. A fantasy. Pray that Othello has not just kind of become obsessed about nothing. And then Emilia tells Desdemona, but jealous souls will not be answered so. They are not ever jealous for the cause, but jealous for they are jealous. It is a monster begot upon itself, born on itself. So Desdemona says, I never gave him cause, which means I gave him no reason to be jealous of me, or to suspect me for of doing anything that I am not supposed to do. And Emilia says, yeah, but jealous people don't need a reason. Jealousy is something which creates itself, begot upon itself. Begot means born or bred, and born on itself. So it's this kind of self-creating, self-sustaining monster which consumes people, and they don't need a reason for it. So again, Emilia clearly wants to kind of comfort Desdemona here, but at the same time, they also have this kind of educative relationship in which she is trying to tell Desdemona a little bit more about the world and a little bit more about what jealous personalities are like. And Desdemona has no idea. She has no experience of this. She has no experience at all, really. Other than listening to stories about Othello and being a rich teenager in Venice, which is not going to prepare you for the complexities of the world very well. And so at 4:2, few scenes later, we see Emilia being questioned by Othello, and she is fervently but quite calmly and very directly defending Desdemona against Othello's suspicion. And right at the start of the scene, Othello says, you have seen nothing, she says, nor ever heard, nor ever did suspect. Notice the way that Emilia's sentences here are just very calm and direct. There's a contrast here between the way that Iago talks to Othello, where he's always kind of adding little uncertainties and ambiguities and questions. And Emilia just says, no, Emilia, but then I saw no harm, and then I heard each syllable that breath made up between them. So Othello says, that's in response to Othello's question, you have seen Cassio and she together, and Emilia says, yeah, I saw her and Cassio together, but I heard everything they said, and I heard every breath they whispered, and there was nothing going on between them. And she says, they never whispered, nor send you out the way, never to fetch her fan, her gloves, her mask, nor nothing, never, my lord. And Othello says, that's strange. And it's not strange, perfectly normal, but Othello has been kind of driven to suspect everything that Desdemona is doing, and he's being taken over by this idea of her, so much so that he thinks that her behaviour when she appears to be acting normal is strange. And Emilia says, look, I would lay down my soul at stake. I would bet my own soul that Desdemona is faithful and that she's honest. And if you think anything else, remove your thought. Get rid of this idea that Desdemona is not honest, because it doth abuse your bosom. It's By abuse here, it's taking advantage of you, it's using you, it's taking over you in a way which is doing you a disservice. You need to get rid of this idea. And if any wretch has put this in your head, let heaven requite it with the serpent's curse. The serpent's curse is a reference to the Bible, in which the serpent is made to crawl away on its belly after having brought about the fall of Adam and Eve. So it's basically the worst punishment. So if anyone has put this idea in your head, in your imagination, again, remember fantasy, remember Othello and Desdemona. It's all about images. It's all about the imagination that we have of people and the way that this affects how we can relate to them in real life. Let heaven give it the worst punishment. For if she be not honest, chaste, and true, there's no man happy. The purest of wives is foul as slander. So she says, look, if Desdemona is not honest and faithful, then there is no such thing as a faithful wife. She is the most honest, Othello, get yourself together, get rid of this idea, and just it's not based on anything. And she's very calm, she's very direct about this, and she's really standing up for Desdemona here. She also doesn't understand what Iago has done, so she doesn't understand the cause of Othello's jealousy, but she's very capable of calling it out for what it is, which is nonsense and an obsession which Othello has no reason to feel. Okay, so following this, Emilia is ordered out of the room, and Othello interrogates Desdemona, insisting that she has been unfaithful to him, and Desdemona denies it completely. We talked about this again a little bit last week, and once Othello kind of leaves, Desdemona is very, very distressed, and Iago and Emilia and Desdemona have a conversation in which Iago attempts to show that he doesn't know what's going on, that he doesn't really understand what's come over Othello, when of course he knows that he's responsible for it. And Emilia says, what does this gentleman conceive? Referring to Othello here. And by conceive, she means imagine. What's in his head? What is he thinking? What's gotten into him, And he's now Othello has said to Desdemona that he's convinced that she's unfaithful, and that the more that she denies it, the more that he becomes convinced that she's lying. And Desdemona, Emilia says, how are you doing, to Desdemona? She's very sympathetic. She's very worried about her at this point. And Desdemona says, half asleep. And Emilia said, good madam, what's the matter with my lord meaning Othello. And Desdemona says, with who? She said, with my lord, madam. Desdemona says, who is thy lord? Emilia says, he that is yours, sweet lady. And Desdemona says, I have none. So she doesn't know her husband anymore. And do not talk to me, Emilia. And Emilia says, here is a change indeed. So she's getting very, very worried about this. Things have really taken a turn for the worst, and Emilia doesn't really understand it, and Desdemona is becoming more and more traumatized, essentially, by the situation. And Desdemona tells Emilia to go and get Iago. And again, none of the characters know that Iago is responsible for what's happening at this point. And Iago says, what's the matter? And he kind of pretends that he doesn't know what's going on. Emilia explains that Othello has whored Desdemona, which means he's called her a whore. He's insulted her. He's laid such heavy terms upon her as true hearts cannot bear. So he's really hurt her, and she's worried, and they're both worried at this point. And it's clear that Desdemona just can't understand this. She can't cope with it. And Emilia says, "Hath she forsook so many noble matches, her father and her country and her friends, to be called whore? Would it not make one weep?" So she's given up a lot of good suitors and a lot of, yeah, she gave up a good life. She could have had a better husband than this, is what Emilia says. And it's enough to make you weep. So again, Emilia is very sympathetic with Desdemona, even though she knows that Desdemona is, is innocent, is inexperienced. And remember, there is a class difference between these two as well. So how that plays out might be an interesting question to think about if you were thinking about staging these scenes. And then Emilia says, "I will be hanged if some eternal villain, some busy insinuating means kind of someone who makes people think things, and cunning rogue, some cozening slave to get some office, so to get some kind of benefit or post, have not devised this slander. I will be hanged else." So Emilia essentially figures out what's going on, but she doesn't know it's Iago. She says, "I will be hanged, so I bet my life that some terrible person is plotting this whole thing, is making Othello do this so that he can get some kind of benefit out of it." Yeah, and she doesn't know it's Iago, but she does know that something's going on. And she says, "The Moor's abused by some most villainous knave, some base, notorious knave, some scurvy fellow." She's really angry at this point, and she's really just kind of, getting things off her chest. It's quite a ridiculous situation, and she knows there must be someone out here behind it. And then she says, Iago is getting a bit stressed at this point. He might sense that he's close to being found out, and he says, "Speak within door," which means keep your voice down. People can hear you outside. And Emilia says, "Oh, fie upon them. Oh, shut up. Fuck it. I don't care. Some such squire he was that turned your wit the seamy side without, and made you suspect me with the Moor." So Emilia kind of says, "Look, shut up, man. Someone else manipulated you into thinking that I had slept with Othello, which is ridiculous. And we know that that's ridiculous. We know that that didn't happen. But Iago actually does say earlier in the play that he thinks Emilia has slept with Othello, which we know is ridiculous, but he uses it as one of his justifications for what he's doing in his manipulation of Othello and his kind of destruction of the lives of the characters around him. And then Desdemona kind of gives this very heartfelt speech where she says essentially that she will love Othello regardless of what she does to him, that she still loves him and she still wants to try and understand him. And she says, "Unkindness may do much, and his unkindness may defeat my life, but never taint my love. So even if his unkindness takes away my life, it will never taint my love." And again, as a modern audience, we have to ask ourselves how inexperienced Desdemona is here. She may mean this very sincerely, but at the same time, this is the first time that she's been in love. This is the first time that she's seen a relationship play out. And this is also quite a naive thing to say. And we can think about the way in which, if Emilia was on stage at this point, the way in which she might be reacting to what Desdemona is saying. And on the one hand, it's a very kind of faithful, It's the classic image of an obedient wife who is willing to follow her husband even as he's abusing her. But at the same time, it's not the words of someone who is very experienced, and it's not the words of someone who is very good at self-preservation. And Emilia knows this. She knows that something is very wrong in Othello and Desdemona's relationship at this point. And Iago says, as the scene ends, that he will do what he can to kind of talk to Othello, and that maybe his mood will change back. And the audience and Iago both know that that's a lie that Iago is going to make, is manipulating the whole situation. However, none of the other characters do know that, although Emilia, who is probably next to Iago the cleverest person in the play, is beginning to figure things out. So Act 4, Scene 3 is the kind of longest time that Emilia and Desdemona have on the stage together. At the start of the scene, which we kind of cut out, Othello tells Desdemona to go to bed, to dismiss Emilia and to wait for him. And we know that he's planning something bad. And then we see kind of Emilia helping Desdemona to get undressed and to get ready for bed. Desdemona tells a story about someone that her mother knew who was in love with someone who turned out to be mad, and it went very bad for him. And she says that she has this kind of song stuck in her head which she can't get out, which this friend of her mother's used to sing. And it's a very sad song about losing everything, and we kind of get the sense that Desdemona is preparing herself almost for death at this point. And then she has the conversation with Emilia about fidelity, and again Emilia shows a kind of cynicism and a kind of knowledge and a kind of practicality, which Desdemona is entirely lacking in the way that she thinks about relationships and the way that she thinks about men and women. And we see this here. Desdemona says, "Dost thou in conscience think, tell me, Emilia, that there be women do abuse their husbands in such gross kinds? Like, do you think that women actually do the kinds of things that Othello is accusing me of doing?" And Emilia says, "There be some, no question. There be some such, no question. So, yes." And Desdemona says, "Wouldst thou do such a deed for all the world? Like, was there anything that could make you be unfaithful to your husband?" And Emilia says, quite honestly, but also I think in a way which is intending to kind of cheer Desdemona up and make the situation seem a little bit less serious. "Why would not you?" And Desdemona says, "No, by this heavenly light. Like, I would not do it, by heaven, by God." And Emilia says, "No, neither I by this heavenly light, but I might do it in the dark." So there's a little joke here and a little pun. And again, Emilia is simultaneously trying to comfort Desdemona and trying to break this very, very dark mood which has descended on her, and at the same time trying to educate her a little bit. And Desdemona says, "Why wouldst thou do such a deed for all the world?" And Emilia says, the world's a big thing. The world's big. It's a big thing to get for a small vice like infidelity. And Desdemona says, "Nah, I don't think you would do that. I think thou wouldst not." And Emilia says, "I think I should, and undo it when I had done." So she says, "I would do it, but then if I got the world by doing it, I would be able to make it as if I hadn't done it, And then you get this kind of quite complex image in which Emilia says, "Why, the wrong is but a wrong in the world, and having the world for your labour, 'tis a wrong in your own world, and you might quickly make it right. So if you get the world by being unfaithful, then once you've got the world, you can change it so that it's as if you were never unfaithful. And in some ways, she's just kind of playing with Desdemona here. She's just trying to be funny and to be clever, and we see this kind of witty conversation quite a lot amongst Shakespeare's characters. But in another sense, she's trying to take away the seriousness of the idea of infidelity. She's trying to educate Desdemona both into the reality of what some relationships are like, and she's also trying to make it seem as if what Desdemona is almost accusing herself of at this point isn't true. You know, even if you had been unfaithful to Othello, it wouldn't have been that big of a deal, you know. Seems to be what Emilia is saying. And Desdemona still can't believe it. She's still this kind of naive young woman. Says, I do not think there is any such woman. And Emilia says, yes, a dozen, and as many to the vantage as would store the world they played for. And then she gives this really great speech where she says, look, I think it's their husband's fault if wives do fall. Say they slack their duties or pour our treasures into foreign laps. So what if they treat us badly and just take everything that we give them, and then in terms of affection, in terms of support, and then just pass it on to others? Or else break out into peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us, you know? And this is exactly what Othello is doing to Desdemona. Or say they strike us, or scant our former having in despite. Or scant our former having in despite means say they take things away from us. Why? We have our goals. We have our, you know, we hurt, we feel pain. And though we have some grace, yet we have some revenge. You know, we have an ability to endure. We have grace, we have mercy. But at the same time, we have ways of getting revenge against our husbands. Let husbands know their wives have sense like them. They see and smell and have their palates for both sweet and sour, as husbands have. So let husbands know that wives think, feel, and experience things in the way that they do. And this is something that the husbands, at least in Othello, don't appear to really understand. You know, Iago treats Emilia as if he's just there to satisfy her whims, and Emilia knows that. And Othello is either convinced that Desdemona is an absolute angel who loves him purely for the sake of his own suffering, or is kind of the blackest devil on the world, on the earth. Like he can't relate to her as if she's just a person, you know. And Emilia knows this, and she knows that that's the way that men tend to treat women, as this kind of product of their fantasy and as this kind of imagination. There's something very narcissistic about this kind of relationship. And I don't think it's just a relationship that we see in Shakespeare's time. I think we see it all over, and we still see it today. And then she says, what is it they do when they change us for others? So what is it that they're doing when they're unfaithful to us? Is it sport? I think it is. So is it fun? Yeah, I think so. And doth affection breed it? Affection are kind of not affection in the sense of love or feeling good things towards someone, but affection in the sense of changes of mood. So is it bred by affection? Yes, it is. Is it frailty? It is so too. Yeah. So it is a weakness in men which makes them do this. And then she says to Emilia, have we not affections, desires for sport and frailty as men have? So do we not feel all these things too? And then she says, okay, let them use as well. And if they don't use as well, so let them treat as well, is what use means here. Let them know, if they don't treat as well, then they should know that the ills that we do, their ills instruct us. So So wives may behave badly because they are taught how to behave badly by their husbands. And let men understand this fact. And none of the men in Othello, none of the husbands appear to understand this fact. And Emilia in this scene, yeah, she's quite indignant, and she's quite clear that Desdemona needs to kind of become a bit wiser and needs to have a more realistic view about what men and marriages are like, at least what Emilia has experienced them as being like. And then Desdemona says, good night, good night. Heaven me such uses send. So may God grant me a husband who treats me well. We know that that is not going to happen, unfortunately. So the final scene, there's some more info about this scene here. You can look over it if you want to look at the PowerPoint. It's usually, one thing that's worth saying is that the scene is usually played as if it's very sad, as if Othello is trying, as if Desdemona is aware that something very bad is going to happen, and as if she's kind of accepting her fate. This is what it means when she sings the song. She's almost singing her own funeral song. However, if you look at the RSC clip, which I mentioned here, it's Desdemona in that scene and in that production is presented as being much more feisty and just frustrated and annoyed that Othello is being such a fool. However, usually that isn't necessarily the case. And if you watch the film, you can see how Desdemona is presented much more as this kind of loving, naive, and innocent creature who is not clued into the world. And Emilia kind of has this educative, protective, but also servant-mistress relationship with her. So, final scene in which we see Emilia is when Othello has killed Desdemona. Emilia enters the room in order to tell Othello that Cassio has been assaulted. Part of the plan that Cassio and Desdemona have, part of the plan that Othello and Iago have at this point is that Iago will kill Cassio and Othello will kill Desdemona. However, Cassio is not killed. Cassio gets away, and Emilia tries to come to tell Othello that this has happened, and she sees Desdemona dead and immediately kind of shouts out and says, "Oh, what have you done?" And Othello says that Desdemona was false as water. Water in Shakespeare is often described as this thing which it's very unreliable. It changes its form. It flows everywhere. So if something is false like water, it means you never know what it is. You can't grasp it. It's not solid. And Emilia says, "This is ridiculous. You're a fool. Desdemona was faithful." And Othello tries to shut her up. He threatens her, and Emilia says, let's find it. "I will not charm my tongue. I am bound to speak. My mistress lies here, murdered in her bed." And Othello tells Emilia earlier that Iago was the one who said that that Desdemona had been unfaithful. And we see this kind of realization in Emilia, and she keeps on repeating the words, "my husband." So Othello says, "Thy husband knew it all," and Emilia says, "My husband?" Othello says, "Thy husband," and Emilia says that she was false to wedlock. And then she keeps on, after everything Othello says, Emilia repeats, "my husband," as if she's just realizing what Iago has done and how evil he is, and she can't quite get it. And then she says, "Look, he's lying. He lies to the heart." And she stands up to Othello extremely bravely and says, "Thou hast not half the power to do me harm as I have to be hurt. So you can't hurt me more than I can endure, and I will make sure that everyone knows about this." She calls him a gull, a dolt, just words for kind of stupid, numbskull people. Says, "I care not for thy sword, I'll make thee known, though I lost 20 lives." And then she starts shouting, "Help, help, help, the Moor hath killed my mistress." And then Iago comes in with some officers, and we really see Emilia's fidelity to Desdemona here. And this is the first time that we see her break her duty to her husband. And she addresses everyone in the room and says, "Good gentlemen, let me have leave to speak. 'Tis proper I obey him, but not now." And then she says, "Perchance, Iago, I will ne'er go home. So I'm never going home now. You don't own me anymore. I won't fulfill my duty to you because I'm more bound to tell the truth about what has happened to Desdemona." And then Othello mentions the handkerchief. That recognizance and pledge of love which I first gave her, I saw it in his hand. It was a handkerchief, an antique token my father gave my mother. And then Emilia says she realizes exactly what Iago has done, because she knows that she's the one who's responsible for this as well. And she says, she kind of screams out, "Oh heaven, oh heavenly powers." And Iago, you can see in the film that this is an extremely tense moment between Iago and Emilia. She says, "Look, hold your peace, hold your tongue, woman. Don't give me away. You are my wife. Obey me." And Emilia is not having any of that, obviously. Iago tries to stab her to shut her up, and then she says, "O thou dull Moor, you stupid person, Othello. That handkerchief thou speakest of, I found by fortune, and did give my husband, for often with solemn earnestness, more than indeed belonged to such a trifle, he begged of me to steal it." And then she says, "She gave it Cassio. No, I found it, and I did give it my husband." Iago tries to accuse her of lying. Othello knows now that everything is up, that he's been completely manipulated and fooled. He tries to attack Iago. Iago stabs Emilia, and the whole thing descends into chaos. And then Emilia dies and asks to be laid by the body of Desdemona. And that's the end of their relationship. So, as we see, it's Emilia's intervention which kind of fully unravels and causes Iago's plan to fail. So much so that he kills her. So much so that he tries to shut her up, and she refuses to obey him. She shows loyalty to Desdemona at the end. And yeah, we get a really strong and lasting sense of friendship and of duty that Emilia feels towards her mistress. And yeah, we see that this is a duty which goes up to death and almost beyond death, and that costs Emilia her life. Okay, so guys, that's Othello. I know that it's a lot, as I've said several times, but hopefully you'll get something out of what we've talked about in terms of this play. I hope that you do, because obviously, I find it a very interesting, very exciting play, even though I do think some readings of it which don't focus so much on the relationship between husbands and wives can miss the point. I think that one of the most productive readings of Othello is that it is as much about the relationship between husbands and wives as it is about race, which is usually the most important feature of the play when it's discussed by critics. Not to say that race doesn't play a very important role in Othello, but yeah. So, task for this week. As usual, I'm going to ask you to perform a kind of analysis of one of the scenes, just because this is good practice for your oral examination. Think about how you would produce the scene if you wanted to do your own production of Othello, and you can take some of the inspiration from the scenes and the performances that I've uploaded. And also you can come up with your own ideas too. And also, a bit of a second task is just think of some keywords that you would use to describe Desdemona and Amelia's relationship, and think about why it is that you've chosen those words. And again, you don't have to send me the work if you don't want to, but we can talk about it in the next catch-up session if you want, or you could send it to me and I'd be happy to have a look at it for you. And yeah, also have a look at the little extra documents that I've uploaded too, because hopefully they will fill in some of the questions that you might have about the play in terms of what happens when, and who the characters really are. Because like I say, I know that I've thrown a lot of info at you. Okay, so yeah, that's Othello. I hope that you have a good week. Next week we're doing Endgame, which is less difficult to follow, but is also very interesting. Very different kind of play, but also a play that in some ways centers on a kind of